As somebody that personally likes to collect some physical media, the combination of video games and books is something that I see going together really well. And while, in my opinion, there's not an outstanding number of video game books out there, at least not particularly good ones per se, the ones that are listed in this video that I'm going to discuss are ones that I think are worth your time and worth taking a look at. The thing is, when you compare video games to TV, there are far more books about TV and different actors and things like that. It's a much larger medium because it has a longer history. The cool thing about video games is the people who wrote these books were right there on the forefront of the industry. You know, many of them were either gamers themselves when video games were really hitting the mainstream in like the 80s and the NES was becoming popular and console games as a whole was becoming a big deal, or they were even some of the game developers or people that interviewed the game developers from those very early days. So video games being really not that old of a medium for entertainment makes these books be very early takes on the industry as a whole because the industry is very young. So I'm going to start things off with a book that I've talked about on this channel in the past, and that's 1001 Video Games You Must Play Before You Die. Tony Mott's book here from like 2010 is dated, but not in a way that really matters, because when you're looking at 1001 games you want to play before you die, you're likely aware of many of the games that came out in the past 10 years. Maybe you already played them yourself, but you may have forgotten about some of the older titles that came out in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and even before that he covers in this book. It's really an amazing hardcover full color look that really has some very nice pictures and overall a fantastic presentation. When I talked about this book back in 2018, I bought it on eBay for something like $6, and while the price of this book has shot up now to where you're probably paying more like $15 to $30 used, I still think it's even worth that price. Next one is Console Wars, another book that I talked about actually just last year on this channel. Now if you're into business or marketing as a whole, this is a great combination of what you typically find in a business book and what you would find in a video game book. It basically looks at the console war that occurred between Nintendo and Sega throughout the 80s and 90s. It doesn't look at it so much as, this is the type of game that was being developed here on Sega, and this is the type of game that was being developed here by Nintendo, and kind of what was playing out in the game development space. This is more of a business approach. I like the fact that it takes a look at kind of the executives, the decision makers, the people that, lobbied to get these systems into Walmart. They lobbied to get them onto store shelves. They worked different bundles, different price points, and in that way, it's a very kind of, I would say, relatively high level look at the business of video games, or at least as high of a level look as we've been able to see in this industry thus far. And in that way, Harris's book is a very, very good one, and one that I recommend you check out. It's not going to be something that has, full color pictures or whatnot, though maybe it has a few pages of that in the middle. It is literally just a novel told through a conversation type perspective, even though he is taking some merits with each conversation because he ultimately wasn't there. He's piecemealing it between different first-hand interviews that he was able to get. Next one here is Game On. This one is definitely wrote at more of a young adult level. It has kind of a cartoony, comical tone to the way it speaks to the reader, and this isn't going to appeal to everybody, as some older readers may find that very off-putting, and you can definitely see that in the Amazon reviews. Though for the price that I paid for this, which I think was like $13 at Barnes & Noble, and of course you can find it for less online, this is a relatively inexpensive paperback for something like 400 pages of video game history that's divided in kind of a year-by-year segment where each given year in video game history it highlights one specific game and kind of delves deeper into that. The writer of this is an NFL Street developer, and I absolutely loved the NFL Street game growing up, so I had to give it a go for that reason. But again, it's one that will probably appeal more to a young adult or teen audience rather than somebody who's already read a ton of the books on this list. But it is relatively inexpensive in its own right. And another one that's relatively inexpensive is Mike Diver's Retro Gaming, which looks like a really generic book, and I understand that. That's what I thought when I picked up at half-price books for something like $6, and you can probably find a copy on Amazon around $8 at this point. It's one that is in full color and covers just a little bit of blurbs about various games over history, and as one that's just kind of neat to be able to flip through. It's a hardcover, looks good on your shelf. It's one that if you're to choose any book off this list and you don't want to spend a ton of money, it's probably the way to go. But there's a few really good ones that I think everybody should have in their collection, and ultimately this is going to be the best quality content that you could have if you were to only choose 2 books. And that's The History of Video Games by Stephen Kent. These are fantastic books. There's 2 of them now. The first one was published in 2001. I remember reading it when I was a kid. It was a little bit of a higher reading level maybe than I was at, being in elementary school at the time, but I think I even referenced it for some sort of book report or different research I needed to do, where back in elementary school you had to actually reference a physical book. In the early 2000s, there really wasn't any large-scale sort of almost encyclopedia of gaming quite like Stephen L. Kent had written, and it turned out that that first History of Video Games book released in 2001 would only be part 1, and it covered, roughly the 80s to the 2000s. It had some stuff prior to that, but he released a sequel in 2021 covering 2001 to 2021 that kind of just bridges the gap to make it be really a very complete look at video game history between the 2 novels. These are massive books. I mean, I'm talking 500 some pages each, over 1,000 pages here if you would get both. And considering the books are relatively popular, at least in the video game book space, you can get them for probably less than $20 a piece, especially the newer one that you could probably easily find a new copy of because it is in such recent print. I think the first one got put back into print as a result of the second one releasing. Fantastic books, huge books, and something that I think everybody should have in their collection if you're able to, put the money up to do so. I'm talking like $40 for 2 books that really cover the complete history of gaming. Of course, there are going to be some liberties, some things that he left out because he just can't cover every little thing, but it is going to be the most complete view of the gaming industry. And then 2 books that I think I want to check out. I haven't yet. I've heard very good things about, and I think I'll be reading sometime this year yet, is The Masters of Doom. This one just covers the history of Doom. It came out in the early 2000s, I want to say 2004, 2005, and has a complete look at the people behind Doom, kind of everything that it had as a pop culture icon, the good, the bad, and of course there was some bad with Doom, the media association with it and whatnot, and it just sounds like a really interesting novel that gets a ton of praise. The next one is Service Games. This is the history of Sega. And Sega, obviously, very turbulent history that, could have been covered very well in the Console Wars book that I read, the History of Video Games books by Stephen L. Kent. But Service Games kind of gives its own look. And while people have kind of said that this is kind of like a best friend sort of giving you a rundown on Sega, because it is kind of told in that sort of conversational tone, and maybe even has some errors even in the enhanced version that's been re-released here. That's the current version, but regardless, people have said it's a joy to read. And so these are some of my favorite video game books, ones that I've checked out, already own, or want to check out this year. I know that as a medium, video game books maybe don't get quite enough attention, but it seems like a lot of these books, because maybe they receive relatively limited print runs, do maintain their price more than, say, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, or some really popular book that had a ton of copies printed. So you may be paying a little bit more for an older book than you would expect if you're used to shopping for books on Amazon or eBay and buying used copies. But I think that many of these are worth it, particularly the ones that have tons and tons of content, hundreds of pages like the History of Video Games books, or the ones that are in awesome, huge full color print like the 1001 Games Play Before You Die. So these are definitely some books worth checking out. Thank you guys for watching. I'm Bailey, and I will see you in the next video.